Early November, we'll see American voters heading to the ballot box. Yeah, they still use ballot box to decide whether Donald Trump will go on to serve a second term as the US president or not. And not so surprisingly, the incumbent president Donald Trump may well prosper as the pandemic plays itself out. But there are at least 10 reasons to be skeptical about the pessimistic forecast by his opponents of his chances of re-election to American presidency. While no president would engineer such a crisis to secure votes, Trump may well prosper as the pandemic plays itself out. So here are the key issues that could stand President Trump in good stead coming presidential election in November. The US death COVID-19 toll matches the most pessimistic predictions by Trump critics. And despite a halting, comically inept start and some truly bizarre detours, Trump will claim credit for leading the battle against it. Other subnational leaders have raised their profile in the crisis, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo most notably. But unless Joe Biden makes one his running mate, none of them is in contention against the president this year. Trump's COVID-19 leadership has been a disaster, but hasn't yet proved catastrophic. This crisis should have exposed everything wrong with his presidency, but unfortunately it hasn't. No matter however stupid statements he made about the COVID-19 and wearing a mask, but his idiosyncrasies, which people the world over either love or hate him for, haven't precluded a scientific response from the American medical community. Trump's style has been variously absurd. He's Donald Trump after all. What can you expect from him? But the substance of his response hasn't been absurd, although he made lunatic statements but acted responsibly. He has closed America's borders just as left-wing Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern had closed New Zealand's borders. In 2016, Trump's first election campaign was framed by sticking it to the Chinese communists and their subsidizing of cheap labor, which according to him had destroyed US manufacturing jobs over the decades. In 2020, he'll campaign against the country's wet food markets, and the American, he'll argue, were killed by these wet food markets. Trump waged a trade war to correct the Chinese Communist Party's economic duplicity, and now he'll assume the mantle of a world leader, destined to call the alleged Chinese public health deception of COVID-19 to account. Trump will likely avoid blame for the economic slump the world is now entering. Chinese President Xi Jinping won't be that lucky. Western governments are pulling fewer punches when it comes to blaming China for their human and economic losses. More than 70% of Britons, according to a recent opinion poll, want an international inquiry into China's handling of the initial outbreak. Sweden is closing the Chinese government-run Chinese language and cultural centers called Confucius Institutes, the first European country to do so. And the Indian government will hardly excuse its greatest rival, China, for the chaos coronavirus has unleashed across the country and its border scuffles with the Chinese. Trump has started to echo these popular sentiments. He built his real estate credentials by suing his enemies. He'll almost certainly join efforts to sue the People's Republic of China, a process members of his own party have already started and which may well prove popular among the voting public. Trump has also extended huge support to India and Taiwan to teach the communist dragon a lesson. Even if Trump makes economic missteps between now and November, the causes of the crisis will remain biological. His economic statecraft may well be able to cut some slack given the scale of the pandemic. Donald Trump, Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson are pursuing not identical but similar strategies to rescue the productive parts of their respective economies and to save free market capitalism. Barack Obama was re-elected in 2012 for having done much the same. Trump's opponents see him as the equivalent to the president who failed to arrest the Great Depression between 1929 and 1933. But a better analogy would be Warren Harding or Calvin Coolidge. These Republicans both secured election during and after an influenza pandemic, magnitudes much greater than that we face today, by insisting that the chief business of the American people is business. The internationalism of the Democrats at that time was rejected by the people, and it took them until 1932 to win the presidency again. Joe Biden is not even Barack Obama, the man on whose coattails he hopes to ride into the White House. Of course, in a news cycle which favors the sitting president, any challenger faces the problem of relevance. But Biden has been worryingly inept in taking clear positions on what he would be doing differently. He faces charges of sexual assault from 1993. The Democrats are united in hitting Trump, but remains divided ideologically. Trump continues to be blessed by poor opponents, Hillary Clinton and her bungling campaign in 2016, Xi Jinping and his coronavirus travels today, and now Joe Biden, the least worst candidate the Democrats could offer in 2020. That two events that should have reduced his electoral chances have instead remade them. The failed effort by Democrats to erase the 2016 result by impeaching him and removing him from the office actually energized Trump. It convinced him and his base to fight harder and more aggressively against their opponents. Importantly, the repetitive impeachment hearings revealed the depth of the Biden's exaggerations with the Ukrainian regime. Trump has already started to campaign on what he says are Biden's comparable connections to China. America is truly a federal country where there is clear demarcation between the Union and the states, and Trump will claim that his response to COVID-19 has remade America's federalism. People world over often assume that American politics is run from the Washington DC. The coronavirus has reminded the world of the depth of politics across the country's 50 states, haphazardly and not always with wisdom, leading to unnecessary deaths. Trump's competitive style has re-energized the contest between state and federal governments. He has inadvertently questioned a core liberal assumption that federal power must be expanded to meet every exigency, that Washington is one big security blanket. Instead, Trump has obliged governors and mayors to become policy entrepreneurs. The coronavirus response has exposed not the conspiracy behind what Trump calls the deep state, but its incompetence, and moved power back to the states. Crisis or no crisis, it is an almost unwritten law of the US electoral politics that incumbent president always wins. Only two men since 1932 have stood for re-election and failed. However, this does not guarantee Trump's victory. Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush were both undone by crisis they could not master. But this incumbent wins principle could make American voters elect Trump again to the office. Last but not the least, a bonus point that could ensure Trump to chair the American presidency again is Trump's foreign policy adventures in global theater. Trump calmed down the situation between Israel and the Arab nations to great length and pacified relationship between North Korea and South Korea. And America pulled back the US troops from Afghanistan and made Canada and Mexico agree to American terms and conditions in the new trade deal between Mexico, the US and Canada, and made NATO countries realize the importance of American military aid. And American voters surely wants to vote for a president who bullies the enemies. But here, in this case, Trump is bullying the friends.